You travel through the swamplands of Black Marsh, fighting with the small pockets of Aldmeri Dominion soldiers as you walk through the ruins of the old Aliad and Kothringi settlements. You sneak through the dense swamps in hopes of avoiding some of the horrific creatures it hides. As you sneak around, you encounter a Dunmer woman who signals for you to come over. She says to you,
Zook has been abandoned for years. The only one who lives there now is a crazy Kothringi. The Dominion tied him up in the center of the village.
Hello and welcome to Anatomy of Fiction. In today's video, we will be discussing the silver humans of Black Marsh, so the Kothringi. More specifically, why did the silver humans of Black Marsh vanish? To do this, we must first go over several things, starting with who were the Kothringi. So who were they descended from, where did they inhabit, and what did they look like? Then we will move on to the history of the Kothringi, so the various historical events they have been involved in and their legacy. After this, we will discuss the Kothringi society, their culture, their religion, and their practices. Finally, we will move on to discussing the key players who would be important in the disappearance of this race. So let us begin with who were the Kothringi. The Kothringi were a group of humans that descended from the Nadic humans. They inhabited Black Marsh. So the Kothringi are believed to be an ancient race, with evidence dating them back to the early Merithic era, or even potentially existing before this. They were known to have silver skin, unlike any other group of humans, which made them rather distinct, especially from the other humans that lived in Black Marsh, including the Orma, who were another race of humans that were born without eyes, along with the Yespest and the Hawali, who were also tribes descended from the Nades and are now extinct. The Kothringi as a group primarily occupied the Shadowfen region of Black Marsh, with 2 villages still being visible in the year 582 in the Second Era, these being Zook and Stiltrise village. But there were also a large amount of Kothringi knights present over in the Gideon Imperial garrison. Zook was actually built over a Bar-Sabic Aliad site, known as the Temple of Sol. This settlement of Zook being named after an important knight of Empress Tavia, who had established it. It was renamed to Zook to honor its founder. In the ruins of this settlement, we see what seems to be the last member of the Kothringi to actually be alive. From this, we can see the silver-toned skin that the Kothringi were said to have. We also see this in descriptions of Zook, who the settlement was named after, where he was described to have silver, reflective skin. So based on who the Kothringi were, why did they disappear? Well, if we look at their environment, this being Black Marsh, we can see that a large number of other tribal groups also disappeared from the region over the eras, these being of the tribes of men like the Orma, the Yespest, and the Hawali, but also the tribes of elves like the Cantamiric, the Lothi, and the Bar-Sabic Aliads, along with a group known as the Lil Mothit, who were fox-like and said to be related to the Khajiit. Now, each of these groups had their own reason for being in Black Marsh. Some were sent there as prisoners, others were refugees, some of these tribes just made their way on their own. But no matter how they got there, all of these tribes, like the Kothringi, went extinct for their own reasons. For some, it was due to Black Marsh not exactly being the most forgiving of new homes. For others, they were already hunted in their homelands and with dwindling populations leaving them vulnerable to whatever would threaten them next. Considering that the Kothringi were descended from the Nades, there is a possibility that they were also related to the Kothri, one of the groups that the Aliads had taken from Niben, which is the Nibene Basin, which as a region is rather close to Shadowfen in Black Marsh, which is where the Kothringi were found. So it is likely that the Kothringi were the members of the Kothri that escaped the Aliads, eventually developing into the Kothringi, leading to the decreased numbers in their population and having to adapt to a rather different environment. This would explain the confusion as to where their origins date to when it comes to the relics of the Kothringi. But this is only one piece of the puzzle, not the full picture. To learn more, we should discuss the history. So when it comes to the Kothringi and their existence in Black Marsh, they have been there as far back as records go. We see evidence of the Kothringi existing in Black Marsh as far back as the ancient Argonians, prior to the event known as Dusk Fall. This being what they called the slow decline of their former style of civilization, where they lived in stone nests or Zanmirs to their current civilization. From what we know about Duskfall is that it happened long before the year 198 in the First Era, as this is roughly when the Barsabic Aelids arrived in Black Marsh. Now we know it happened before their arrival, as the Aelids described them as older ruins, this being the Zanmirs. However, they doubted the lizards' capability when it came to building these complex structures. They referred to the Argonians as lizards. We can however see evidence of the Argonians and Kothringi fighting each other at the Zanmir known as Hismir, this being through a journal entry along with the comments of an ancient Argonian, this all occurring before the Barsabic Aelids moved to Black Marsh. So the Kothringi were recorded as attacking the Argonians that had inhabited the settlement of Hismir. Now, considering the disappearance of the Kothringi, much of their history is not well documented. However, we do know that the Kothringi were present as knights in the imperial garrison over in Gideon. We see this specifically with Zook, who was a loyal servant, knight, and confidant of Empress Tavia. Now, he was alive at the end of the First Era to the beginning of the Second Era, being active as a knight during the very end of the Second Empire. So in the last year of the Second Era, with Zook being a part of the Imperial Guard, it is believed that Zook would sneak in and visit Empress Tavia, who was imprisoned in Castle Giovese. With this, there is the suggestion that he helped Empress Tavia plot the death of her husband Emperor Roman III, who had her imprisoned there. So under the orders of Empress Tavia, Zook would hire a former soldier known as Miramor to assassinate the emperor. However, this would instead lead to the death of Empress Tavia's son, Prince Julek. Now, with the death of her son, Empress Tavia would become incredibly depressed, with her grief leading to her death. Before Tavia died, she would tell Zook where she had left her fortune. Seeing that she had no children left, she would leave the money to Zook, but would make Zook promise to finish what they had started. So this would lead to Zook seeking out the Morag Tong for their assistance in assassinating the Emperor, Romain III. He would pay the Night Mother for their assistance in getting rid of the Emperor. Now, this is all claims from one book, which some claim is well researched. Others claim that it is just a historical fiction. We do, however, know that Romain III was assassinated and the Morag Tong were blamed for his death. However, who arranged it is debated. We do know that Zook did set up the settlement of Zook, arriving with riches, being known for his wealth and generosity among the other Kothringi. But anyway, jumping forward to the Second Era, this being in the year 560. Here we see the appearance of the Knahaten Flu. The Knahaten Flu would first appear in Stormhold, a city in Shadowfen in Black Marsh. Now, with this, the Knahaten Flu was said to cause several symptoms, these coming in stages, starting with general malaise, loss of appetite, and fatigue in the first several hours. Then the disease progresses. The person begins to have constantly watering eyes, their skin develops a rash that is bright red and granular, but this rash does not itch. Then within the 24 to 36 hour mark, the person who is infected will begin to have nosebleeds, their tears will have blood, the granular rash will then have spread all over their body. They will also have developed a deep, raspy cough. Then within 36 to 48 hours, this cough will produce a bloody phlegm. Now, in most cases, those who were infected with the Knahaten Flu would pass away within 72 hours after showing symptoms. However, others would manage to live as long as 5 to 7 days, although still passing from the horrible disease. With this disease came several suggestions for treating it, how it spread, along with how to prevent it from spreading. So firstly, when it came to treating it, there were many beliefs around its various cures. One of these coming from a young Redguard woman by the name of Perazada. Now, Perazada would claim that she had a vision sent from the divines. In this vision, she was shown the cure for the Knahaten Flu. She would even go as far to use this cure on a village that was about to be destroyed, along with its inhabitants. Perazada's cure would work on the village, and they would all be saved. Now, this cure was rather strange, as it would require the claws of a clanfear boiled in salt water. The patient would then drink this water. However, this treatment was never considered an approved cure, as there had been many other fatal so-called cures for the Knahaten Flu. That would not stop the black market demand for clanfear feet increasing. The clanfear cure was dubious at best. We would see this with its own inventor, Perazada, passing away from the Knahaten Flu a few years later. With the clanfear cure, it did cause other broths and drinkable cures to rise in popularity, especially due to the expense of clanfear feet. One of these being chicken broth. Now, chicken broth was not exactly a cure, but as a treatment, it did help to soothe the throats of those infected, along with helping to ease the cough. off. However, again, it is not a cure for those that are infected. Now, others would take a different approach when it came to treating the Knahaten flu. This approach instead would target the rash, as many, considering it was not itchy or irritating, would actually leave the rash alone. But some would instead treat the rash. Doing this, they would cover the rash in bandages, poultices, or just clothing. Now, this did not actually treat the Knahaten flu. However, it seemed to do something interesting. It appeared to decrease the spread of the disease. So there is an idea on how both the disease is spread and how to decrease the spread of the Knahaten flu. This being that the Knahaten flu is spread by physical contact with an infected person's rash. By decreasing the likelihood of contact through covering it up, then it may decrease the spread. However, there are other ideas about how the disease is spread. One idea being that it is spread through infected air. We see this belief over in elsewhere in Senchal in the year 560 in the Second Era, as parts of the city would be infected with the Knahaten flu, this belief being that the flu blew over from Argonia, this being what they called Black Marsh at the time. This would lead to parts of Senchal being destroyed. Now, this is not the only belief of how it spread. There is also the idea that the Argonians were actually carriers of the Knahaten flu. Now, this idea came from the idea that they were the creators of the Knahaten flu, with there being a suggestion that an Argonian shaman created the disease as an act of retaliation for how other races treated the Argonians. But none of this really has to do with the Kothringi, or does it? Well, if we look at some of the suggested origin stories for the Knahaten flu, we can see part of their importance in this horrid part of history. So again, with the Argonian origin story, the Kothringi and the Argonians are noted as not getting along. Now, considering that the Knahaten flu started in Stormhold, which is part of Shadowfen, this is important for two reasons. One, it was the capital of the Dunmer slavery operation in Black Marsh, and two, it was the region that the Kothringi happened to inhabit. With this and the story that the Argonians were the creators, considering that they were believed to be immune to the Knahaten flu. However, there are some Argonians who claim that they do develop the Knahaten flu and that they did not create it. For the Argonians, they call it the half-swim sniffles, being rather mild instead of a death sentence that it is for other races. Now, it would be claimed that they did not create it, as they were rather upset at the suffering that the Knahaten flu had caused the Khajiit, due to the friendship that these races had, although they were fine with the deaths it had caused within the Dunmer, this being due to, in the Argonian opinion, no one likes the Dunmer. Now, there is also another possibility when it comes to a race creating a disease to wipe out the Kothringi. Now, this actually comes from the Aelids. So the Aelids and the Kothringi, specifically the Barsabic Aelids, were known to have their own conflicts. We also see there being comments from the spirit of an Aelid known as Morillier. These comments wishing the Knahaten flu had actually worked, suggesting that the Aelids may have had something to do with the creation of the Knahaten flu. And when asked, this specific Aelid spirit would not comment on whether or not they had made the Knahaten flu. But anyway, back to the timeline. Because of the severity of the Knahaten flu, there would be what is known as the Crimson Ship. This ship would set sail in the year 563 in the Second Era. Now, this ship would be filled with Kothringi tribesmen who were attempting to flee the deadly Knahaten flu. So the ship was set to go around Tamriel, visiting different ports, but they were turned back from every port. After a year, they would eventually make their way to Hammerfell. However, they would be turned away once again, so they would redirect, sailing into the Abyssinian Sea. It is believed that the Crimson Ship and its passengers have never been seen again. Now, what is interesting about this is that there are several unverified accounts claiming otherwise. The first of these coming from a book known as The Pirates of the Abyssinian. Now, this book is debated as whether or not it could be considered a work of fiction or an account of something that truly occurred. But in it claims that those who witnessed the Crimson Ship were pirates. They themselves were on board their own ship, which had been badly damaged. So the pirates saw this ship as an opportunity to take it over, replacing their own damaged ship, not realizing what the ship actually was. So the pirates would climb on board, initially finding no one to confront them. No guards, no sailors, and not even any passengers. So they would initially assume that those who were on board the ship were hiding from the pirates rather than being willing to fight them. So the pirates would kick in the cabin door, assuming they would find the owners of the ship cowering there, and they would rush in. However, after only a few steps, they would stop and they would bring in a torch. For there was no living soul on that ship waiting for the pirates. Instead, they had supposedly stumbled upon the Crimson Ship. And what they had found in that cabin was the bodies of the Kothringi that had boarded the Crimson Ship all those years ago. Now the captain would order everyone off the Crimson Ship and back to their own However, considering the rumors seemingly ringing true, no one from that pirate ship lived long afterwards. Considering that no one from the pirate ship lived, that tale is not verifiable. However, there is another tale of someone claiming to have encountered the Crimson Ship. This claim comes from a Khajiit beggar by the name of Koralit. Now, Koralit claims that at some point prior to the year 582, in the Second Era, he served in the Imperial Army. This being during the time of the Knahaten Flu. He was conscripted to work on a warship, this warship being the Bountiful Mara. Koralit had gone below deck to rest after working 3 shifts. Koralit would fall asleep below deck, awaking the next day to find himself alone. His crewmates were missing. The only thing he would find is a note scribbled by one of his crewmates mentioning the Crimson Ship. This would leave Koralit stranded for some time, alone on the ship, waiting to be rescued. However, this is what he claims caused his string of bad luck. As for those who believed in the Crimson Ship story, they believed that he was cursed with bad luck and would bring that to any future ship he was on. And for those who did not believe, Koralit would be accused of murdering all of his crewmates. This would even land him in the stocks. He would end up on the streets as a beggar because of all of this. Now, if we move on to the year 582 in the Second Era, moving back over to Shadowfen, we are visiting Stillrise Village. Now, what makes Stillrise Village the location of our historic holiday? Well, the fact it is cursed. This being due to what would occur in the year 561. So as we know, the year 561, the Knahaten Flu was spreading throughout the lands. One of the villages affected was the Stillrise Village. Now, the leader of Stillrise Village, Chieftain Sulak, was desperate to save her village, so she would go to an old temple of Clavicus File that members of Stillrise Village had previously uncovered. Here at the temple, Chieftain Sulak would beg for immunity for her village from the disease that was killing them, and the Daedric Prince of Bargains, Clavicus File, would give it to them. Well, in return for the curse he bestowed upon them. It did technically grant them immunity, however, they were stuck in a sort of in-between. Not being completely alive, however, not being dead either. Now, the problem would lie in the year 582. When the Worm Cult would come and pay them a visit. The Worm Cult would attempt to steal the soul gem that held the spirits of the villagers. If the Worm Cult were successful, it would allow the necromancers to control the members of the Stillrise Village, having them as essentially mindless foot soldiers in their army. However, this would thankfully be stopped by a brave hero known as the Vestige. The Vestige would manage to steal back the soul gem array from the necromancers of the Worm Cult, giving back the villagers their freedom. However, it is unknown if the Vestige would allow the village to continue to be cursed, or they would be put out of their misery. But anyway, moving on to the village of Zook in the year 582, as this is where we would see the last fully alive Kothringi. Here we find a Kothringi man by the name of Drilk. Now, Drilk was the last living member of the village of Zook. Being the last person in the village and not having interactions with other members, Drilk would become the village madman, losing his sanity from the lack of interactions with others. He would begin using the royal we to refer to himself, viewing himself as royalty. Along with this, he would believe that his fellow villagers were still alive. Now, in the year 582, the Vestige would first encounter Drilk, tied to a pillar by the Aldmeri Dominion. The Vestige would save him from the interrogation by the Aldmeri Dominion. With Drilk still under the impression that he was king of the Kothringis, he would order the Vestige around. The Vestige would also help bring Drilk back to his senses, allowing Drilk to realize that he was the last remaining Kothringi of Zook. Eventually, Drilk would recover some of his memory, including the original location of the keystone, this being that it was originally in the Temple of Sul. However, this is not where the keystone was located. The Vestige would learn this from a rather angry Ayleid spirit. The Ayleid would claim that the Vestige was coming to steal more of the Ayleid treasures. They would tell the Vestige that Drilk stole the keystone, so the Vestige would leave the Temple of Sul, heading back to Drilk. Drilk would then remember that he had taken the keystone, absorbing it, this likely being the reason why he had survived the Knahaten Flu, whilst his friends and family had not. This would then leave the Vestige with the decision to either take the keystone and Drilk would pass away like the rest of his village, or leave the keystone and allow Drilk to be alone as the only Kothringi. So based on the history of the Kothringi, why did they vanish? The Kothringi were not exactly the most popular with the other societies in Black Marsh. We see this with them having conflicts with the local Argonians and the Barsabic Aliads. Now, along with this, we also see the rumor that these groups may have caused the plague known as the Knahaten Flu to spread throughout Tamriel. Considering that the Knahaten Flu began in the area that the Kothringi inhabited, this being Shadowfen, providing some evidence to suggest that the Knahaten Flu may have been a targeted attack against the Kothringi, and even the Dunmer. Now, when it comes to the Knahaten Flu, we do know that this was devastating to not just the Kothringi, but with several other groups disappearing around this time as well. We do see several Kothringi attempt to avoid this fate through unnatural methods, with there being deals with Clavicus Vile turning the majority of the members of Stillrise Village into a group of immortal, yet not really alive, things, and Drilk of Zook Village, who would absorb an Aliad keystone which would allow him to survive the Knahaten Flu, unlike the rest of his village. Others would attempt to escape the disease by sailing away on the Crimson Ship, which is now a thing of legend, suggested to be cursed by many. The ship was never allowed to dock at any of the ports of Tamriel, due to the idea the Kothringi on board may have had the Knahaten Flu, leading them to sail off into the Abyssian Sea. When we look at the history of Tamriel, much of the Kothringi's presence ends after the Knahaten Flu. The few who do remain through unnatural means. We see that the Knahaten Flu was an incurable plague on the entire continent that caused many to suffer. Although there were many attempts to treat the disease, there was little that could be done to help those who had become infected, especially when there was no understanding of the disease. So with it being prominent in Shadowfen, the Kothringi, who were only really found there, had no hope of resisting the infection. But this is only one piece of the puzzle, not the whole picture. To learn more, we should discuss the society and culture of the Kothringi. So when it comes to the society and the culture of the Kothringi, there are several things we should discuss to gain a better understanding of this group. To do this, we should firstly discuss their religion and their folklore. Now, if we look at the religion of the Kothringi, this has changed over the eras, with different deities being worshipped at different times, with there being evidence of Clavicus Vile worship in the early times of the Kothringi. We see this with not only a medallion found depicting Clavicus Vile, but also the Kothringi uncovering one of the old temples in a mine, and of course, later using that to make a deal to protect the Stillrise village from the Knahaten Flu. So Clavicus Vile is the Daedric prince of trickery and bargains. He primarily focuses on granting wishes and providing power to those who worship him. The Kothringi worship of Clavicus Vile was primarily seen in the Merethic era. We also see that the Kothringi in their worship have other deities which have been important. One of these being Zen. So Zen was known as the god of toil and was once described as the chief deity of the Kothringi. Their worship of Zen coming after their worship of Clavicus Vile. Zen is often viewed as the god of agriculture, with his worship being seen throughout parts of Tamriel. It is even suggested that the Kothringi sailors spread the worship of Zen to Valenwood. Anyway, Zen is acknowledged as one of the original spirits, and Et Ada, referred to in the Altmer creation myth as Zen, so X-E-N rather than Z''E-N. But what is interesting in the worship of Zen, it disappeared not long after the Knahaten Flu, as some of the stronger worshippers, like the Kothringi, were wiped out due to the illness. We see as part of the Kothringi worship of Zen, there are still some artifacts correlated with Zen that the Kothringi created, like their devotion shovel and the Kothringi idol of Zen. Now, along with Zen, the Kothringi were also known for their worship of Dibella, with Dibella being regarded as their special patron. Dibella known as the goddess of beauty and the lady of love. In descriptions of the Kothringi when discussing their worship of Dibella, they have been referred to as the lustrous folk. Little is known about the Kothringi's methods of worship when it comes to religion. However, their mark on Gideon can be observed as there is still a temple of Dibella present there. Along with what we have observed about their religion, we do also see some remnants of the folklore of the Kothringi. We see this with the description of a creature known as the Gil's Ha Butcher Eel. These eels were river monsters that were said to be so large that they could swallow a Hajj motor whole. These being the large turtles that are not so friendly that inhabit Black Marsh and other parts of Tamriel. So the eels were special for other reasons. They were believed by the Kothringi to produce bog blue jasper in their gizzards. Other than this, not much else is known about the folklore of the Kothringi. We do, however, know various details about their culture, like the importance of music in their culture, this being seen through the comments of an Argonian. Yes, although the Argonians and Kothringi have previously warred in the past, some groups of Argonians did get along with the Kothringi rather well. An Argonian by the name of Gim Shah would claim that the Kothringi had many instruments. They would claim that the Kothringi would share their music with the Argonians during feasts. Gim Shah claimed that the Kothringi had many different types of instruments. They would describe incredibly large drums made out of hollowed logs. The Kothringi would use the sinew from cliff striders to make bow harps, but this was not their most loved instrument. No, the Kothringi loved chimes. They would hang these chimes from the trees, but they would also wear little bits of metal on their bodies that would also make noise as they walk, making the Kothringi some of the more musical out of all the tribes and races. Now, apart from this description by the Argonian, perhaps the only instrument we see left is the Leviathan bugle, which made its way to the Bard's College after the deaths of the Kothringi. Now, this bugle was made from the horn of a Leviathan, these being massive reptilian beasts that were found over in Black Marsh that were considered to be very powerful. This bugle was dyed a silvery blue colour to match the colour of the Kothringi and was once used to produce Kothringi music. Now, with their love of music, we do see their talent for creation and crafting come through in the other areas, with there even being evidence of the Kothringi crafting armour, considering they were not the most fond of various forms of clothing. Along with this, we do see in the Kothringi warfare that they have been adept at using throwing knives, axes, and even harpoons in battle and in hunting. Off the battlefield, we do see many other useful items created by the Kothringi. We see this with their creation of metallic ropes, these ropes being incredibly strong and unlike the creations of other races, which would make these ropes incredibly valuable, potentially for sailing, as the Kothringi were known for their sailing ability, also creating their own boats. These ships, or canoes, were built to navigate the swampy lands of Shadowfen. Based on their skill in shipbuilding, it is possible that they also crafted the Crimson Ship. But not much is known about the design or type of boat used, as there has never been a verified description of the ship. Now, there are hints at the uses of the Kothringi canoes based on some of the other creations of the Kothringi, like their harpooner's wading kilt. So this gear was most likely used for hunting and fishing in the swampy areas, which the boat may have also been useful for. However, not much else is known about the use of Kothringi boats, considering that the tribe was not well documented before their extinction. We do know that this was one of the few examples of clothing that the Kothringi wore. However, we do see a description of the Kothringi claiming that the Kothringi preferred their birthday suits over any real forms of clothing. This would likely mean any protective armor, hunting or fishing gear, or even any clothes that would have kept them up with the latest trends throughout Tamriel were not likely to be found with the Kothringi. Now, with the Kothringi, not everything was about battlefields and hunting. They also were known for their decorations. We see this with their creations of humming dolls. Now, these humming dolls were unusual, as they were created out of a combination of an air bladder and reeds. These reeds were used to form the figure of the doll and hide the air bladder. Now, the air bladder does serve a purpose in the doll. When the doll is squeezed, this creates a humming sound. The Kothringi were also known to create dream catchers and mats, which all would have been potentially used to decorate their homes. So based on the culture of the Kothringi, why did they vanish from Black Marsh? Well, from what we know about the Kothringi and their history, there is the accusation that the Argonians created the Knahaten Flu as a sort of act of revenge. This being against the Dunmer, the Kothringi, and all of the other races that had mistreated them. However, we do see with a more recent account coming from an Argonian by the name of Gim Shah. In this, Gim Shah describes an event from their childhood, describing the relationship between the Argonians and the Kothringi as much closer, with the Kothringi inviting the Argonians to join them in a festival. In this, Gim Shah claims that the Argonians would never destroy the Kothringi, so the idea of a targeted attack through the Knahaten Flu seems unlikely. However, the Kothringi were still vulnerable to the Knahaten Flu, even without it being the Argonians plotting to take them down. We do know that all races outside of the Argonians were prone to the Knahaten Flu. However, very few would completely disappear. So there must be something about the Kothringi, or several things about the Kothringi, that would make them more likely to disappear without unnatural interference. Part of this may be due to their cultural aversion to clothing, as it is suggested that the Knahaten flu may be spread through contact with the rashes it causes. But this is only one part of the story, not the full picture. To learn more, we should move on to the key players. So when it comes to the famous or well-known members of the Kothringi, there are not many. This being due to there being very little record of the Kothringi being kept. However, we do see some, albeit small, records being kept on certain Kothringi members, like that of Zook, who was active from the very end of the first era to the beginning of the second. Now, most of what we know about Zook actually comes from books. The main book mentioning him being 2920, the last year of the first era. Now, in this book, Zook is described as a loyal knight to the empire, well, to the empress of the empire. He was considered the confidant of Empress Tabia. In this book, it is claimed that Zook would assist the empress in plotting the death of her husband, the emperor, after he had imprisoned her all of those years. This being suggested how Zook got the money to fund the village he would found. Now, the Kothringi would claim that they knew little about his time in the imperial palace, but they would know him for other reasons. The Kothringi would know Zook for his wealth, his honor, and his generosity. This would lead to Zook being described by the Kothringi as Lord Zook or Lord Founder in the terms of the village he would create on his return from the service of the empire, considering that he would create and support the village, which would thrive for 5 generations before, of course, being renamed in the honor of Zook. Now, this is all that is really known about him due to the poor documentation of the Kothringi. However, if we look to the later years of the Kothringi in the second era beginning in the year 561 and over in the Still Rise village, we can see several Kothringi who were important in the attempt to prevent the extinction of the Kothringi. The first of these being War Chief Halushk. So War Chief Halushk is important during the times of the Knahaten Flu and the attempted survival of the Kothringi, as he was pivotal in attempting to convince Chieftain Sulak to approach the Daedric princes for assistance with the Knahaten Flu. This being partially through the letter he would write Sulak, where Halushk would reinforce the seriousness of the situation, informing Chieftain Sulak that he had in fact developed the Knahaten Flu, like much of the village, and would no longer be able to provide her guidance like he had in the past, considering that he didn't think he would last the week. Now, after the village was granted immunity by Clavicus Vile, Halushk was the only leader who viewed it as more of a gift than a curse. Halushk was adamant in staying as one of the undead skeletons, continuing to live out his immortal life along with the rest of the village. He wanted the Kothringi in Still Rise village to continue on living in this strange sort of way, as it protected them for just over 20 years. However, not everyone felt the same way throughout the course of the 20 years. If we look to Shaman Chira, he was originally encouraging of the transformation of the village into the undead skeletons. We see this with his initial documentation of the Knahaten Flu, recording the first infections in the village, which came from the twin apprentices who had been in Mudtree village for work. These apprentices brought the infection to Still Rise village. The Knahaten Flu would then spread throughout the village rapidly, with Shaman Chira even beginning to feel the symptoms like many of the others in the village. Shaman Chira initially wanted Chieftain Shulak to seek out a sort of blessing from Clavicus Vile to save them. This would of course mean turning their back on Zen, as Zen was unable to save them. However, Chira felt that this was not salvation, but a mockery of it, wishing that they instead died out like the other Kothringi. Now, if we look at Chieftain Sulak, we see another important character in the attempted survival of the Kothringi over in the Still Rise village, of course. So Chieftain Sulak was the leader of the Still Rise village prior to the village making the deal with Clavicus Vile, along with after the deal had been made. So Sulak was actually rather skeptical in approaching the ancient shrine of the Daedric prince when compared with the other leaders of Still Rise village, eventually being convinced by the war chief and the shaman. However, with the years spent as an undead skeleton and the attempted control by the worm cultists, Sulak would lose their position as the leader of the village, considering that they were not safe, nor were they really Kothringi anymore. So based on the important people of the Kothringi, why did they vanish? Well, if we look at the Still Rise village, we can see that the leadership, this being Shaman Tura, War Chief Halushk, and Chieftain Sulak, had attempted to prevent the village from disappearing. They were willing to contact an old god, one that is not exactly known for fair deals, in an attempt to save their village. They desired to preserve their village, knowing that they did not have the means to treat it in their traditional methods, and Zen, their current god, was not able to help them. Now, even though Chira and Sulak regretted their decisions to save their village, their actions were part of what saved the village, but would also endanger them, like when the worm cultists attempted to turn them into part of their undead army, further encouraging their distaste for the situation. However, Halushk still views it as a blessing, as a way of saving the Kothringi. Even if they could easily be controlled, Halushk did wish to prevent the control of the Kothringi again. However, he did still wish to keep them as undead skeletons. Considering that the Still Rise village is only around due to unnatural means, their presence was really only a prolonging of the inevitable, and to some, an extension of their suffering. So Still Rise village leadership, although they had the best in mind for their village, did not manage to save them, they only managed to prolong their suffering. So based on who the Kothringi were, their history, the culture, and society of the Kothringi, along with the important members of the Kothringi, we can finally answer the question, why did the silver people of Black Marsh vanish? Well, if we firstly look at the Knahaten Flu, we can see that the Kothringi were incredibly vulnerable as a population to this disease. But considering that most races across Tamriel were also vulnerable, but did not vanish when it came to the plague that was the Knahaten Flu, what really made the Kothringi different? Well, we can see from the history that originally the Kothringi, like the Dunmer, had a poor relationship with the Argonians, which could have suggested a targeted attack against these races, as there was a claim that an Argonian shaman created the Knahaten Flu in retaliation for how they were treated. However, with more recent claims from Gim Shah, the Kothringi and the Argonians were friends, with the Argonians being invited to join in the celebrations and festivals of the Kothringi, even if they didn't understand them. Gim Shah claims that no child of the Hist would destroy something that beautiful, these being the Kothringi and their celebrations, thus breaking down the idea that the Knahaten Flu was a targeted attempt to get rid of the Kothringi and the others that had hurt the Argonians before. But with the Kothringi being wiped out by this infection, there had to be something that set them apart from the other races, which made them more vulnerable to dying off from the disease. Well, there are multiple things to consider. Firstly, the Kothringi, unlike many races, were a fairly isolated group, only being found in Shadowfen in Black Marsh, whereas most other races have had some form of spreading throughout Tamriel. We even see this with descriptions of the Argonians being found as far as Hammerfell. So the Kothringi were rather local to a small area, having a rather small population. But this would not be the only issue that would increase the risk of disappearing. There are descriptions of the Kothringi culture mentioning their aversion to clothing. Now, this does not sound like the most interesting or relevant tidbit until we actually remember some of the more interesting points about the Knahaten Flu, like its granular rash. Now, this rash is one of the telltale symptoms of the Knahaten Flu, and it is also suggested to be a method of transmission, or the method of transmission, should I say. So with the Kothringi not being known for covering up, these rashes would be exposed, meaning that those who were caring for the sick would easily become infected, leading to this infection spreading quickly throughout a small village. However, even with the spread of the Knahaten Flu throughout the Kothringi people, we do see one attempt to potentially save the Kothringi, this being the Crimson Ship. But there is one issue with the Crimson Ship. Considering that the Crimson Ship had no guaranteed safe location to dock, even if there were no infected people on board, it would only have a limited amount of time before those on board would run out of supplies, and well, eventually die, as they were not able to get clean water and food from land. They also had no real way to do this from sea. So the Crimson Ship was always truly doomed. Even with the Kothringi being skilled sailors, they had no true way to save themselves with this ship. So the Kothringi vanished for several reasons, this being due to their culture leaving them more prone to the spread of the Knahaten Flu. The Kothringi were not found throughout Tamriel, instead only in Black Marsh, as they were a rather isolated group, and the Kothringi on board the Crimson Ship did not have a guaranteed safe place to land, leading to them likely running out of supplies if the ship did not have anyone infected on board. So let me know in the comments why you think the Kothringi disappeared. A special thank you to all of our lore archaeologist supporters, you guys help keep this channel running. And thank you to anyone who is joining our memberships. In the meantime, if you enjoyed this video, you should check out this one. It is about who exactly the Dunmer of the Elder Scrolls series are.